The letter arrived on a humid Tuesday morning, the kind of Louisiana day where the air itself felt like a thick, wet blanket. Inside the ornate envelope, a lawyer's elegant script informed Elias Thorne that he had inherited the Fairchild Plantation. Elias, a historian specializing in American folklore and agrarian life, stared at the document, a strange mix of dread and morbid fascination taking root. The Fairchild Plantation. He knew the name, of course. It was a footnote in a forgotten chapter of American history, known less for its cotton or sugarcane and more for a series of bizarre, unexplained deaths that had plagued the Fairchild family for generations. Elias had been living in a small, cramped apartment in Baton Rouge, surrounded by stacks of books and research papers. The inheritance was a lifeline, a chance to escape a dead-end academic career and the suffocating city life. The plantation, located deep in the bayou country, promised solitude and a new project, perhaps a book on the plantation's dark history. He called his best friend, a freelance journalist named Maya Reynolds, who specialized in investigative pieces. "You're not serious, Elias?" Maya's voice crackled through the phone. "The Fairchild Plantation? That place is notorious. Didn't the last owner just disappear?" "The records say he died of a sudden illness." And the one before him. And the one before him," Elias explained, a nervous energy thrumming in his voice. "It's a pattern, Maya. Every single master of the house, from the first Fairchild to the last, died under suspicious circumstances, always after a family dinner. The poison supper myth." "A myth for a reason," she countered, but Elias could hear the curiosity in her tone. "It's probably just a series of coincidences, Elias. A bad bloodline, maybe. Or something far more complex," he said, already lost in thought. "I'm going. I need to see it for myself. I've always been drawn to the stories that others dismiss." The drive to the plantation was long and uneventful, the road narrowing as he left the main highway, eventually turning into a gravel path bordered by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The air grew heavier, the silence more profound. When he finally arrived, the house loomed before him, a grand yet decaying antebellum mansion. The white paint was peeling, the columns were stained with green algae, and the windows, dark and empty, looked like the eyes of a blind ancient creature. A groundskeeper, a stoic elderly man named Silas, met him at the front door. Silas had worked on the plantation his entire life, a living testament to its secrets. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of hard labor and unspoken knowledge. "Mr. Elias," Silas said, his voice raspy, "I've been expecting you." Silas gave him a brief tour of the main house. The grand staircase creaked under their weight, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that penetrated the shuttered windows. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old wood, mildew, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. Elias's study, a room filled with built-in bookshelves and a massive oak desk, was the only place that felt remotely welcoming. "The library," Silas said, his gaze lingering on the shelves. "The family records are all in here. Mr. Fairchild, the last one, he spent his last days in this room, they say." "And what do you say, Silas?" Elias asked, his voice low. Silas looked at him, his eyes holding a profound sadness. "I say some histories are better left unread, Mr. Elias. Some shadows are best not to disturb." That night, Elias tried to settle in. The solitude which he had craved now felt oppressive. The house groaned around him, the sounds of settling wood and the wind whistling through broken panes echoing like whispers. He sat at the oak desk in the study, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light. The family records Silas had mentioned were in a dusty chest. He pulled out the first ledger, its leather cover cracked and worn. The first entry was dated 1856, written in a spidery hand. It detailed the life of the first plantation master, Josiah Fairchild. The entry ended abruptly, a note scrawled on the last page. Josiah's mind is gone. He claims to have seen a ghost at the supper table. Tonight, his final dinner is planned. Elias frowned. The next entry, by a different hand, a younger one, simply stated that Josiah had died peacefully in his sleep. A lie, Elias knew. A convenient cover story for what had truly happened. He flipped through the ledgers, each one a grim repetition. A new master, a new set of entries, a sudden decline into madness or paranoia, and a final cryptic note about the poisoned supper. Each ledger concluded with a vague statement of death, always contradicting the implied truth. He found the last entry written by the most recent owner, a man named Arthur Fairchild. It was a chaotic scroll, a descent into madness laid bare on the page. They are watching. Not ghosts, no. They are real, and they are everywhere. The supper. It's not the food. It's the conversation. They poison your mind. They feed on your sanity. The last words were a frantic plea. Don't eat the supper. Don't believe them. The family is not a family. It's a cage. Elias closed the ledger, his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than a series of coincidences. It was a deliberate, horrifying pattern. But what was it? Who were they? And what did Arthur mean by, the family is not a family? Elias felt the walls of the study closing in, the old house no longer a place of quiet refuge, but a tomb of generations of secrets. He had come seeking a story, but he was beginning to suspect he had walked directly into one, and this story was far from over. The first chapter of his investigation had begun, and with it, a cold, creeping dread. The morning sun, though bright, did little to dispel the gloom that had settled over Elias. He felt a profound sense of unease, a cold weight in his stomach that no amount of coffee could lift. The words from Arthur Fairchild's ledger echoed in his mind. The family is not a family. It's a cage. He decided to start his investigation at the source, the town of Belle Glade, a small, sleepy community a few miles from the plantation, was the only place he might find answers. The town's historical society was housed in a crumbling old church. A kind, elderly woman named Martha worked there, her memory a treasure trove of local gossip and history. Martha, with her spectacles perched on her nose, listened intently as Elias explained his inheritance and his interest in the Fairchild family. Her face, a network of gentle wrinkles, hardened slightly when he mentioned the plantation. The Fairchilds, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They were always peculiar, kept to themselves, never married outside their own kind, cousins marrying cousins, that sort of thing. Elias's mind raced. Inbreeding. It could explain a pattern of genetic illnesses, perhaps a predisposition to mental instability, but it didn't account for the consistent, dramatic decline, followed by a sudden death after a specific event. The supper. Did you know any of the later Fairchilds, Martha? I knew Arthur, she said, a sad look in her eyes. He was a strange man, not like his father or grandfather. He was a kind man, but paranoid. He came here often, always looking for something. He told me once that the house was alive, that it was a prison of memory. He told me not to believe the family. What did he mean by that? Elias pressed. He wouldn't say, just shook his head and left. Martha's gaze drifted to the window, her eyes distant. The night he disappeared, I saw him walking towards his house. A storm was brewing. He looked pale, like a ghost. I just had a bad feeling. Elias thanked her and left, his mind swirling with new information. The town, he realized, was filled with people who held bits and pieces of the Fairchild story, but no one had the full picture. The collective memory was fragmented, buried under decades of silence and fear. He drove back to the plantation, the shadows of the ancient trees seeming to reach out and grab his car. Back at the house, Elias went to the master bedroom, the last place where Arthur Fairchild had been seen alive. The room was grand, but stale. He noticed a loose floorboard near the hearth. He knelt and pried it open. Inside, a small locked box. The key was a long, thin piece of metal, and he remembered seeing a similar one hanging from a hook in the study. He raced downstairs and found it. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were three things: a small tarnished silver locket, a single faded black and white photograph, and a leather-bound diary, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. The handwriting belonged to Arthur's grandfather, a man named Edmund. Elias recognized the name from the ledgers. Edmund had been a respected physician. The diary began with entries about Edmund's medical practice and his wife, a woman named Genevieve. But as the pages turned, a darker narrative began to emerge. Edmund was a man obsessed with legacy and control, a stark contrast to the paranoid wreck his grandson would become. He wrote of his son's frail health and his growing concern that the family line was weakening. He wrote of a protocol, a series of interventions to preserve the lineage. The entries grew more clinical, more detached. He detailed his experiments on his own family members, not with poison, but with something far more insidious. He was a master of psychological manipulation, using isolation, sensory deprivation, and carefully curated narratives to break down the minds of his family members. He wrote of creating a controlled environment, a place where reality could be shaped and rewritten to serve his family's dark purpose. Elias's blood ran cold. The poisoned supper was a metaphor. The poison wasn't in the food, but in the minds of the Fairchilds. The family wasn't dying from a physical toxin, but from a psychological one. The conversations, the carefully planned narratives designed to sow paranoia and despair. Each master, as they came of age and took control of the plantation, was put through this protocol. The goal wasn't to kill them, but to break them, to ensure their loyalty and control by making them believe they were losing their minds. The photo in the box was of a young Arthur, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing with his mother and father and his grandfather, Edmund. In the background, in the shadows, was a figure Elias didn't recognize. A tall, gaunt woman with a severe expression. A figure he had seen in the corner of his eye in the house. He picked up the silver locket. It was tarnished and old. He opened it. Inside, a miniature portrait of a woman with sad, hollow eyes and a small, faded note. They took her. Elias felt a cold shiver. The woman in the locket was not Genevieve, Edmund's wife. Who was she? And who had taken her? Elias's mind raced. He had stumbled upon a truth far more terrifying than a simple curse or a series of poisonings. He was a historian, a man who dealt in facts and evidence. This wasn't folklore, it was a horrifying, multi-generational psychological experiment. He was standing on a precipice, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had to go deeper. The secrets of the Fairchilds were far from buried. They were just waiting for a new victim. The revelation that the poisoned supper was a psychological attack, not a physical one, shifted Elias's perspective entirely. The house was not haunted by ghosts, but by the echoes of psychological warfare. The family was a cabal, a twisted group of puppeteers and their victims. He needed to understand the mechanics of this horrifying game. The diary of Edmund was the key. Elias spent the next 2 days in the study, poring over the neat, clinical script. Edmund wrote of his legacy protocol, a system he designed to ensure the family's power and influence would never wane. He believed that the mind was the most powerful tool, and by controlling it, he could control the family. The supper was the final stage. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, with the patriarch of the family at the center, surrounded by his family. The family, Elias now realized, were not all blood relatives. They were chosen acolytes, loyalists trained to manipulate and gaslight the patriarch into a state of paranoia. They would introduce subtle, unsettling details into the conversation, things that were just slightly off, just enough to make a person question their own sanity. Edmund wrote of a specific technique, the doublespeak. They would say one thing, but their body language and tone would imply something entirely different. They would praise the patriarch for his sanity, even as they fed him subtle, contradictory information. The goal was to make the patriarch believe his mind was fracturing, making him malleable and easy to control. The end result was not death, but a total surrender of will. The sudden illnesses were simply the public explanation for a complete psychological breakdown. Elias looked at the photograph again, the one with young Arthur and his family, the gaunt woman in the background. Elias felt a jolt of recognition. Her face, her posture. They mirrored the miniature portrait in the locket. But who was she? And why was she present during this carefully curated family photo? The locket's note, "They took her," now had a chilling new meaning. He called Maya. "I need your help," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I found something. The Fairchilds weren't poisoned. They were systematically driven insane." He explained the legacy protocol, the poisoned supper, and the diary. Maya, a seasoned journalist, was skeptical at first, but as Elias detailed Edmund's chilling methodology, she grew quiet. "This is insane, Elias," she said, her voice filled with a professional dread. "This isn't just a story. It's a crime. A series of crimes." "I need you to dig into the genealogy," Elias said. "The public records. I have a theory. The woman in the photograph, the one in the locket. I think she was the original victim, a precursor to the legacy protocol. Maybe she was Edmund's first subject, the person he tested his methods on. The locket says they took her. Maybe she tried to escape." Maya agreed, promising to start her research. Elias, meanwhile, turned his attention to the house itself. If the house was a prison of memory, as Arthur had said, there must be more. The house was a tool, a stage for the psychological manipulation. The creaking floors, the strange sounds, the whispers in the dark, were these just natural occurrences, or were they part of the design? He began to search for hidden mechanisms, anything that could create a controlled environment. He found a small, almost invisible lever behind a bookshelf in the study. He pushed it, and a section of the wall swiveled open, revealing a small, soundproofed room. Inside, a series of dusty, old-fashioned gramophones, their horns angled to project sound into the study. There were also old cameras, their lenses pointed at the chair where the master of the house would sit. This room was the control center. Elias felt a wave of nausea. He was a historian, not a detective. He was not equipped for this. He had stepped into a house of horrors built not on supernatural power, but on the cold, calculated cruelty of human design. He now realized why Arthur had left the ledgers, the box, the key. He wasn't leaving a warning. He was leaving a confession. He had been a victim of the protocol, but he had also perhaps been a participant. As the sun set, Elias heard a sound from the hallway. A faint whisper. It was the wind, he told himself, just the wind. But the gramophones, the hidden cameras, they had shown him that this house was a machine. It was designed to play tricks on the mind. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A name. His name. Elias froze, his heart pounding. The house was a ghost in the machine, and the machine was now powered on. He was the new master. And the first supper was surely being prepared. The whisper was gone as quickly as it had come. Elias stood in the middle of the study, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He rationalized it away, the old house, the creaking wood, the wind, but the fear remained. The house felt like a living thing, a predator observing its prey. Maya called back the next day, her voice a mix of professional excitement and genuine horror. "Elias, I found something. It's a bombshell. The woman in the locket. Her name was Clara. She was Arthur's great-grandmother, but not by blood. The records are a mess, but I found a birth certificate. She was adopted. Her last name wasn't Fairchild. It was Dubois. The adoption records are sealed, but I found an old newspaper clipping. It's an article from 1898. Fairchild family adopts child of deceased Dubois family. The father, Charles Dubois, was a family friend, a colleague of Edmund Fairchild. He was a psychologist." Elias felt a chill. The first victim wasn't a Fairchild. She was an outsider, a child of a rival. What happened to her? The records are vague. She disappears from public record after she's an adult. No marriage, no death certificate. But I found a letter in a historical archives database. It was a plea from a sister, a woman named Eleanor Dubois, to the local sheriff asking for help. The letter says, "My sister Clara is trapped. The Fairchilds have taken her mind. They say she is mad, but I know they have done this. Please, I beg you, help her. They are playing a wicked game." The sheriff had apparently dismissed it, stating that the Fairchilds were a respected family and the Dubois were known to be flighty. Elias now understood the note in the locket. They took her. It wasn't a kidnapping, it was a psychological abduction. Clara was the original test subject. Edmund, the physician, was also an amateur psychologist, and the Dubois family was the target of his twisted ambition. Elias had to get into the heart of the house, the place where the family would gather for the suppers, the dining room. He had barely set foot in there during the initial tour. It was a grand room with a long, heavy oak table, big enough for a dozen people. The walls were lined with portraits of the Fairchild patriarchs, each one looking stern and unyielding. Elias now saw them differently, not as ancestors but as accomplices. The paintings seemed to watch him, their eyes following him as he moved. He noticed something strange about the portraits. The eyes. They seemed to have a faint, almost imperceptible sheen. He took a chair and stood on it, peering closer. The eyes weren't painted. They were small, concave pieces of polished glass. They weren't just portraits. They were observation points. Small holes were bored into the wall behind the paintings, leading to a hidden passageway. He found the entrance to the passage behind a large bookshelf in the study, a mirror to the one that opened the soundproofed room. It was a narrow, dusty corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway and the dining room. It was a network of spies and observers. The unseen watchers Arthur had mentioned in his frantic scrawl. Elias walked the length of the passage, his heart pounding. It was a claustrophobic crawl space, smelling of dust and decay. He found peepholes at strategic points, one leading to the grand staircase, one to the main living room, and a series of them, like a row of empty eyes, looking into the dining room. He peered through one, his eye against the dusty glass. The dining room was silent and still, but he could see the details in a way he couldn't from the outside. The intricate carvings on the chairs, the subtle cracks in the plaster, the way the light from the large windows hit the surface of the long table. This wasn't just a house. It was a machine, a stage, an elaborate theater of cruelty. The Fairchilds weren't just victims. They were also the actors, the inheritors of the legacy protocol, passing down the horrifying tradition from one generation to the next, until it broke them. Each master, after their poisoned supper, would become an accomplice, helping to drive the next generation into the same state of paranoia and surrender. Arthur Fairchild's final scrawl now made sense. The family is not a family. It's a cage. It was a confession, not a warning. He was trapped, and he had been a part of the horror. Elias exited the passage, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering. If the family was the cage, then who was the warden? Who was keeping the protocol alive? The last male heir was gone. The plantation was inherited by Elias, an outsider. He was the new target. The whispers, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a ghost. It was the machine starting up, preparing for its next victim. The first supper was approaching, and Elias knew he would have to play the part of the unsuspecting guest, all while trying to dismantle the horrifying legacy from the inside. The following evening, a car pulled into the gravel driveway. It wasn't Silas's old pickup. It was a sleek, black sedan, the kind used by lawyers and corporate executives. A woman in a crisp suit stepped out, holding a large, ornate basket. She had a kind but formal smile. "Mr. Thorne," she asked, her voice smooth. "I'm Beatrice Fairchild, a cousin, a distant relative. My family was so sorry to hear of Arthur's passing. We wanted to extend our sympathies and offer a welcome." Elias was caught off guard. He had expected the family to be a dark, clandestine organization, not a well-dressed, seemingly normal woman. He invited her in. Beatrice was charming, asking about his work and his plans for the plantation. She spoke of Arthur with a fond but distant reverence. She mentioned his eccentricities and his lapses of memory in a way that sounded empathetic, but Elias heard the subtle, practiced gaslighting. He knew this was the beginning of the protocol. "The Fairchilds have always been a very close family," she said, her eyes scanning the room as if evaluating his state of mind. "We've had our tragedies, of course, but we always gather together. A family dinner. It's our tradition." She presented the basket. Inside, a roasted chicken, freshly baked bread, and a bottle of wine. "We're holding a small dinner tonight to remember Arthur. It would mean so much to us if you could join. At 7. Elias feigned a polite smile, accepting the invitation. "That's very kind of you. I'd be honored." Beatrice's smile seemed to grow a little wider. "Wonderful. We'll be waiting. Oh, and one more thing, Mr. Thorne. Don't worry about the rumors. They're just stories. A family like ours has always attracted gossip." Her words were a subtle warning, an implicit message not to look too deeply. Elias felt the walls closing in, the stage being set. He knew this was it, the first supper. He had to prepare. He called Maya. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "The family. They invited me to dinner. It's tonight. I'm going. I have to see how it works from the inside." Maya was horrified. "Elias, are you insane? You can't. This is a trap. It's a crime scene. Call the police." "I can't," he argued. "There's no physical evidence. It's all psychological. The police would think I'm crazy. I need to document this. I have to expose them. I'm the only one who can." He told her his plan. He would record everything. He had a small, high-quality audio recorder, and he would hide it on his person. He would observe their every move, listen to every word, and try to find the doublespeak. He would look for the peepholes in the portraits, the subtle cues, the movements that would expose the unseen watchers. Maya, against her better judgment, agreed to wait for his call. As the clock neared 7, Elias dressed in a simple button-up shirt, trying to project a sense of calm he didn't feel. He tucked the recorder into his shirt pocket, the small device a comforting weight against his chest. He walked down the grand staircase, the shadows seeming to lengthen and twist around him. The dining room doors were ajar, a warm light spilling into the hallway. He entered the room. The long table was set with exquisite silverware and a bouquet of white lilies. There were 6 people gathered: Beatrice and a man who introduced himself as her husband, a stern-looking man in a suit, an older couple, silent and observant, and a young man and woman who seemed to be in their 20s. They were all impeccably dressed, their faces composed and unreadable. They welcomed him warmly, but Elias felt an intense, scrutinizing gaze from all of them. The conversation started innocently, about the weather, about the history of the house. Elias played along, his mind racing. He noticed the subtle things first. When he spoke, the young man would nod in agreement, but his eyes would dart to the others, a silent question in his gaze. The older woman would smile, but her lips wouldn't quite reach her eyes. The conversation shifted subtly. Beatrice began to talk about Arthur, about his paranoia. He had some strange ideas towards the end, she said, her voice filled with a fake sadness. He thought the house was watching him. He thought his own family was against him. "Did you ever notice anything like that, Mr. Thorne?" the older man asked, his voice low. "Anything strange?" Elias's heart pounded. This was it. The psychological attack had begun. He had to be careful with his answer. He had to pretend to be a naive historian, not a man who knew their secrets. "The house is old," he said, his voice steady. "It makes its own sounds. I'm a historian. I appreciate the history." A slight flicker of disappointment in their eyes. They had hoped to see fear. They had hoped he would admit to hearing things, to seeing things. He was not giving them what they wanted. The dinner continued, a silent game of chess. Elias ate his food, careful not to seem paranoid, while also scanning the room for any signs of the unseen watchers. He saw a subtle movement behind the portrait of the first Fairchild patriarch, a slight shift in the shadows. He knew someone was there. They were all there, watching, judging, waiting for him to break. The poisoned supper wasn't in the food. It was in the air, in the words, in the unspoken cruelty of the Fairchild family. And Elias, now the unwilling protagonist of this macabre story, had just taken his first, dangerous step into their cage. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Elias, armed with the knowledge from Edmund's diary, was able to see the layers of the performance. The subtle shifts in conversation, the calculated glances, the leading questions designed to sow doubt. The younger members of the family seemed less polished, their movements more overt, betraying a sense of nervousness and anticipation. They were the trainees, learning the craft from the masters. The conversation revolved around the house, its history, its legends. The older man spoke of a curse that afflicted the Fairchilds, a malady that affected the mind. "It's a tragic history," he said, his voice filled with feigned sorrow. "The house, you see, has a way of revealing the weaknesses in a man's character." Elias realized they were creating a narrative for him, a story to explain away his inevitable paranoia and descent into madness. He was supposed to believe he was cursed, not gaslit. He feigned a contemplative look. "Fascinating," he said. "I've always believed history is a two-way street. The house changes you, but you also change the house." The family exchanged a subtle look of unease. He wasn't playing his part. He wasn't showing fear or confusion. He was an observer, and that was a variable they hadn't anticipated. He excused himself to the restroom, using the opportunity to check his audio recorder. The red light was blinking. It was working. He felt a moment of triumph, but he also felt the weight of their gaze, even as he was out of sight. He could feel their eyes on him, an oppressive, suffocating pressure. He knew they were watching him through the peepholes in the walls. The house was alive, and it was watching his every move. When he returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted. The conversation was less scripted, more personal. Beatrice asked him about his family. "Do you have any relatives, Mr. Thorne?" Elias, who had a small estranged family, answered vaguely. "No, I'm alone, mostly." "A shame," she said, a pitying look on her face. "Family is so important. A man without a family is like a ship without a rudder. It drifts." This was the next stage of the protocol: isolation. By making him feel alone and vulnerable, they could sever his connection to the outside world. He knew they would try to control his communications, to make him question who he could trust. As the dinner ended, Beatrice offered him a gift: a small, antique silver fork. "It's a tradition," she said, "a symbol of our family's welcome. It's been in the Fairchild line for generations." Elias's hand trembled as he took it. It was a beautiful but unsettling artifact. A small, subtle jab at the poisoned supper legend. A symbol of their power. A sign that he was in their game. He thanked her, and they took their leave, leaving Elias alone in the cavernous dining room. He walked into the study, the silver fork in his hand. He looked at the portraits, the unseen watchers. He felt a profound rage. He was not a victim. He was a survivor. He had a weapon, the audio recorder. He had a plan. He stayed up all night listening to the recording. The conversation was an anodyne, polite exchange on the surface. But underneath, a chilling current of manipulation flowed. He heard the subtle pauses, the shifts in tone, the carefully chosen words. He heard the doublespeak. He heard the lies. He had proof. The next day, Elias felt the subtle pressure increase. He received calls from a friend of the family, a man who spoke with a paternalistic concern about his well-being. The man asked if he was sleeping well, if he had noticed anything strange. Elias knew this was another part of the protocol, the friendly check-ins designed to make him feel like his sanity was being monitored. He began to search for more hidden rooms, more clues. The diary of Edmund Fairchild was his guide. He found a small, locked metal box hidden in a secret compartment behind a bookshelf. He pried it open with a letter opener. Inside, a series of detailed floor plans of the house. Not the original plans, but a modified version. The plans showed the secret passageways, the hidden rooms, the peepholes. It was a blueprint for the legacy protocol. But the most disturbing part was a small, handwritten note attached to the plans. It was from Arthur, addressed to his son. "My son," it read, "this is your burden. You must continue the legacy. The family must be protected. You must ensure the next generation is strong." Arthur hadn't just been a victim, he had been a participant. He had been so thoroughly broken that he had embraced his role as a jailer. The cage was a self-perpetuating system. Each new master was groomed to become the next tormentor. Arthur's final scrawl was not a plea for help, but a final act of surrender and a desperate attempt to pass on his burden. The line of Fairchild patriarchs wasn't ending with a poisoned supper, it was ending with a new accomplice. And Elias, by sheer chance, was the next person in line. He was no longer just the protagonist of a story. He was a potential inheritor of a horrific legacy, and he had to break the chain before it consumed him. Elias's sense of urgency was at an all-time high. He was in a race against time, his sanity a prize on the line. The subtle psychological attacks were escalating. He received a series of cryptic, anonymous letters, a new one each day. They spoke of secrets and lies, and were written in a strange, archaic script. The handwriting was a close match to the last entry in Arthur's ledger. They weren't a warning. They were designed to make him believe Arthur's madness was a disease, a contagion. He called Maya, his voice filled with a desperate intensity. "Maya, I have the blueprint. They've been setting me up. I'm not just a target, I'm a potential recruit. They want me to embrace the protocol, to become the next jailer." Maya was silent for a moment. "This is a full-blown criminal enterprise, Elias. It's not just a family tradition, it's a cult. You have to get out of there. We'll take the evidence to the police." "No," he said, his mind racing. "It's not enough. They'll just say I'm paranoid. They'll say I'm being manipulated. The police will just see a family drama, a historical oddity. I need to expose them, to break the protocol from the inside. so it can never happen again. His plan was a final, desperate gambit. He would use their own methods against them. He would set a trap, a public demonstration of their psychological manipulation. He would force them to expose themselves. He knew their schedule from the dinner. They had another dinner planned in a few days, a more formal affair to welcome him into the family. He would use this dinner to expose them. He needed a witness, a journalist, Maya. She was hesitant at first, but Elias's conviction was infectious. "They're a family of liars," he said. "They thrive on deception. The only way to win is to make them tell the truth, to make them reveal who they are." Maya agreed, and Elias began to prepare. He would stage a series of subtle events, things that would mimic the spooking techniques they used. He would make them believe they were successfully manipulating him, but he would be in control. The first step was to play the part. He began to act erratically. He would walk around the house at night talking to himself, his voice just loud enough to be heard by the watchers in the passages. He would leave the doors to the study and the dining room ajar, as if he was losing control. He would feign moments of confusion, asking Silas if he had seen something strange, something that wasn't there. Silas, the stoic groundskeeper, watched him with a sad, knowing look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but Elias knew he was a pawn in this game, a silent observer forced to play his part. He had to be careful with Silas. He was an accomplice, but maybe an unwilling one. The family was watching him, Elias knew. They were monitoring his every move, every subtle sign of his unraveling. He began to receive more calls, more letters. The subtle psychological pressure intensified. He was a fish on the line, and they were reeling him in. The night of the final supper arrived. Maya was hidden in a car a few miles from the plantation, her camera ready, her notebook open. Elias was alone. He walked into the dining room. The table was set for him and the family, but there was a new guest. A young woman, not a Fairchild, but a guest of one of the younger family members, a potential recruit, another pawn. The dinner began, and Elias played his part with a practiced ease. He seemed distracted, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for something that wasn't there. He spoke of the house, of the secrets he was uncovering, of the ghosts that haunted the halls. The family watched, their faces a mask of feigned concern. They exchanged subtle glances, their eyes filled with a cruel, smug satisfaction. He was breaking. The protocol was working. "Mr. Thorne," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You seem troubled. Perhaps the house is too much for you. The legends of the Fairchilds, they can be quite heavy." Elias looked at her, and then, slowly, a cold, empty smile spread across his face. "The legends aren't the problem, Beatrice," he said, his voice low and clear. "The liars are." He reached into his pocket and placed the audio recorder on the table, the small red light blinking. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The masks of concern fell away, replaced by a cold, animalistic fear. They had been caught. Their private, horrifying game was now a matter of public record. Elias had been playing them, and they had walked directly into his trap. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence was deafening. The polite smiles of the Fairchilds had vanished, replaced by looks of pure, unadulterated shock and fury. Beatrice's face was a mask of cold rage. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice a hiss. "It's an audio recording, Beatrice," Elias said, his voice calm, but filled with a profound sense of triumph. "From our last dinner. I've heard every subtle lie, every manipulative word, every bit of your twisted game. I've heard the gaslighting, the doublespeak, the veiled threats. I have it all." The young woman, the guest, looked at the family with wide, terrified eyes. She had been a witness to their cruelty, and now, to their exposure. She was a pawn, just like Elias was meant to be. The older man, the patriarch of the group, stood up, his face red with fury. You have no idea what you're meddling with, Mr. Thorne. This is a family matter, a private tradition. It's a criminal conspiracy, Elias countered, his voice rising. It's a series of psychological assaults, a slow, methodical torture of your own family members. You didn't just inherit a legacy, you inherited a prison, and you became the wardens. He told them about the diaries, about the legacy protocol, about Clara Dubois, the first victim. He told them about the peepholes, the hidden passages, the gramophones. He had uncovered their entire operation. He had stripped away their layers of pretense, their carefully constructed facade of a respectable family. They were exposed, and their power, built on secrecy and fear, was crumbling around them. The young man, one of the newer participants, looked at Elias with a strange mix of fear and admiration. He had been born into this, raised to be a part of it. He was a victim just as much as he was a participant. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice trembling. It's a way to ensure our legacy, to make us stronger." "It's a way to control people," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the young man. "It's a way to turn human beings into puppets. Arthur Fairchild knew it. He left the clues. He left the key to his own prison, hoping someone would find it." Beatrice, her voice trembling with fury, pointed a finger at Elias. "You'll regret this. You've made a powerful enemy." "You're already my enemy," Elias said, his voice cold, "and you have no power over me. The secrets you used to control people are now out in the open. I have a journalist waiting. The police will be called. Your legacy protocol is over." He walked to the large portrait of Josiah Fairchild, the first master, and looked at the polished glass eyes. "You're not watching me anymore," he said, a quiet triumph in his voice. "I'm watching you." He turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the exposed family to face their new reality. He had won. He had broken the chain. He had survived the poisoned supper. He walked to the edge of the property where Maya was waiting. She saw the look on his face, the mix of exhaustion and triumph. She listened to the audio recording, her face turning pale as she heard the chilling, manipulative words. The evidence was irrefutable. The police arrived a short time later, summoned by Maya. The Fairchilds, a powerful and secretive family, were now exposed, their dark legacy a matter of public record. The story would be a sensation. The media would descend on the plantation. The secrets of the Fairchilds would no longer be whispers in the bayou. They would be headlines. Elias had done it. He had faced down the ghosts of the Fairchild Plantation, not supernatural spirits, but the much more terrifying ghosts of human cruelty and manipulation. He had a story to tell, a book to write, but it was no longer an academic exercise. It was a personal victory. He was a survivor of the Fairchild legacy. But as he looked back at the house, a single unsettling thought crossed his mind. The legacy protocol was designed to be a self-perpetuating system. Each patriarch, after his psychological breakdown, became a loyal acolyte, an agent of the next generation's manipulation. Arthur Fairchild had left the clues, but he had also left a warning. The family is not a family. It's a cage. Elias had exposed the family, but what if they were just one branch of a larger, more sinister organization? What if the cage was larger than the Fairchild Plantation? What if the true masters of the protocol were still out there, hiding in the shadows, watching him, waiting for their next move? The war was not over. It had just begun. The following days were a whirlwind of police questioning, media interviews, and legal proceedings. The Fairchilds, a dynasty built on psychological manipulation, were now a public spectacle. The audio recording was a damning piece of evidence, and Elias's detailed accounts of the hidden passages and the legacy protocol solidified the case against them. The young man, the newest recruit, broke down and confessed to everything. revealing the full extent of the family's twisted tradition. The press hailed Elias as a hero, a modern-day detective who had uncovered a dark chapter in American history. Maya's article, a harrowing and detailed exposé, went viral, and the story of the Fairchild Plantation became a national obsession. The house, once a symbol of opulence and decay, was now a monument to human cruelty. Elias, however, felt no sense of victory. The emotional toll of the experience was immense. He was a historian, a man of quiet contemplation, not a public figure. He was exhausted, and the paranoia, the subtle tricks of the Fairchilds, still lingered. He would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing whispers that weren't there, seeing shadows that weren't real. The poison had not been in the food, but it had been in his mind, and it had left its mark. He decided to leave the plantation. The house was no longer a home or a historical site. It was a prison of memories. He wanted to return to his old life, to the comfort of his books and his quiet apartment. He began to pack, his movements slow and deliberate. As he was going through Arthur's old study, he found one more hidden compartment, a small, elegant box tucked away behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Inside, a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was neat and precise, not Arthur's frantic scrawl. It was a final message from a man who had seen everything. The letter was from Silas, the groundskeeper. It was dated a year ago. Mr. Elias, the letter read. If you are reading this, it means Arthur's message got to you. He knew he was next. He knew what they would do. I have watched this family for generations. I have watched them break one by one. I have watched them turn from victims into monsters. I couldn't stop them. I am a simple man, a servant. But I tried to give Arthur a way out. I helped him leave the clues. He wanted to break the chain. But he was too broken himself. He had become one of them. He had a son, a boy named Henry. He was training him. He told me it was the only way to save him. The only way to make him strong enough to survive the madness. I couldn't let that happen. The night he disappeared, I helped him get away. I told him to go far, to never look back, to never be a Fairchild. I told him that I would ensure the plantation went to an outsider, a man with no bloodline, a man who could expose them. Elias's heart ached. Silas, the quiet, stoic groundskeeper, was not a pawn. He was the hero. He was the one who had been fighting this battle for generations, a silent warrior against a psychological cult. He was the one who had finally succeeded in breaking the chain. The last paragraph of the letter was a chilling confirmation of Elias's worst fears. The Fairchilds are just one part of a larger organization, Mr. Elias. They call themselves the Keepers. They're everywhere. They are the ones who manipulate, who control, who ensure the legacy protocol continues. They believe they are perfecting the human mind. They are the real masters. The Fairchilds are just their puppets. Elias closed the letter, his hands shaking. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The Fairchilds were just the first domino. He had exposed a family, but the organization that controlled them, the Keepers, was still out there, hiding in the shadows, watching. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a target. The real battle was yet to come. Elias left the plantation a week later. The house was sealed by the authorities, a crime scene and a tomb. He returned to his small apartment in Baton Rouge, but the familiar surroundings felt alien. He was no longer the quiet historian who studied forgotten chapters of history. He was a living, breathing part of one. The subtle psychological scars of the Fairchild's game lingered. He still felt eyes on him, still heard whispers in the quiet of his apartment. Maya had helped him with the interviews and the legal proceedings. Her article had won a prestigious journalism award. She was now a celebrated reporter, and she saw the world through a new lens, one filled with hidden malice and subtle manipulation. The Fairchild case had changed her too. One evening, months after the plantation was sealed, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat and anonymous. Inside, a single, elegant key. It was a perfect match to the old silver key he had found in Arthur's box. The key to the locked box in the floorboards. A small note was attached. "You won the battle. The war is not over. He is not a Fairchild anymore. He is a ghost. The last gardener will find you." Elias's blood ran cold. The note was from the keepers. They knew he had exposed them, and they were sending a message. They had escaped, and they were still out there. He is not a Fairchild anymore. It was a chilling confirmation that Arthur's son, Henry, had been successfully turned, just as Silas had feared. He was a new pawn, a new agent for the keepers. The last gardener. Elias remembered Silas, the groundskeeper, the man who had a hand in everything. He had been a hero, a secret warrior. But what if the name gardener had a different meaning? What if it was a title, a role in the keeper's organization? What if Silas wasn't a hero, but a turncoat, a final chilling twist in the Fairchild saga? Elias used his last remaining connections and called the police detective who had handled the Fairchild case. "Did you ever find Silas, the groundskeeper?" he asked, his voice strained. The detective's voice on the other end was grim. "No. He disappeared the same night as the last Fairchild. We assumed he ran. No trace of him." Elias felt a new wave of dread. Silas hadn't been a hero. He had been a part of it all. He had led Elias to the plantation, had helped him find the clues, and had watched him unravel the mystery, all while sending an anonymous letter to the keepers. He had orchestrated the entire exposure, making sure Elias was seen as the hero, while he and the rest of the keepers escaped without a trace. The note from Silas wasn't a confession. It was a final act of manipulation, a brilliant final gaslight. The poisoned supper was not the death of the Fairchilds. It was their resurrection as a new, more sinister organization. Elias had not won a battle. He had been a tool. He had been used to expose one cell of the organization, while the real power, the keepers, remained in the shadows. He had walked into a trap, not a historical mystery. He had been the protagonist of a story, and he had played his part perfectly, a role written for him by a master of psychological manipulation. The last line of the note echoed in his mind. "The last gardener will find you." Elias realized he was not a survivor. He was just a temporary victor. He was a witness, and witnesses are not meant to live long. The Fairchilds had been a small part of a larger, more horrifying conspiracy, and Elias, by exposing them, had made himself the next target. The cage was not the plantation, the cage was the world, and he was now in it, a lone figure in a global game of human chess. The real terror of the Fairchild Plantation was not a ghost or a curse, but the chilling realization that some monsters are not supernatural, but all too human, and they are everywhere.